So thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Lowell Wise. I'm Executive Director of Tacoma Tree Foundation, and happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rubén Casas from University of Washington Tacoma. And the title of the talk today is Trees, Cities, and Environmental Justice. I want to give a few words of welcome here as we get started. First of all, I want to acknowledge that we're broadcasting from downtown Tacoma today, and these are the traditional lands of the Puyallup people, where they make their home and speak the Lushootseed language. Just another reminder that we have a YouTube channel, Tacoma Tree Foundation. You can find our previous webinars and other great information on our YouTube channel. And we also have just launched a brand new website. So you can go to tacomatreefoundation.org for lots of information about our programs, about our staff, about our mission, all those good things. Wanted to take another second before I introduce Rubén to thank Tacoma Creates. Tacoma Creates is a City of Tacoma funding source, and they are supporting our public education programs. So if you like our tree walks and our webinars, a lot of that is thanks to the public funding provided by Tacoma Creates, which supports a lot of local arts and culture organizations. So Rubén, welcome. Rubén is a scholar and teacher of rhetoric and writing at UW Tacoma. He's also the faculty lead of the Urban Environmental Justice Initiative at Urban at UW. And in his work and advocacy, Rubén examines how cities and the institutions that comprise them imagine, plan, and build in ways that promote and or discourage community and a sense of place. So Rubén and I have had a lot of great conversations in the past year. Our interests are very aligned, I think. And I wanted to invite him to give a little overview here at the beginning of his work and how that intersects with what we do at Tacoma Tree Foundation. And then also what we're going to do is a little interview section. So after a shorter presentation from Rubén, I'm going to ask him some questions that I have, and then we'll open it to the audience at the end. So that'll be our process today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Rubén has to share with us. So take it away.
Thanks, Lowell, and thanks Tacoma Tree Foundation for inviting me to be with you today for a little while in your evening. As Lowell said, in the past year or so, we have discovered that our interests do align quite a bit. Truthfully, though, when I first moved to Tacoma to assume a job at the University of Washington Tacoma, my lens wasn't yet as focused on environmental justice or environmental issues. I have always been interested in urban settings and cities as complex systems. However, with the onset of the pandemic and some of the writing and research I was doing at the time around parks in particular, I realized that, especially in our current moment, there's really no viable way to talk about the issues impacting cities in the 21st century: housing, transportation, density, poverty, without also talking about the environment and climate change. And central to those conversations are disparities across cities, not only ours, but Tacoma is a case study of cities that where a lot of disparity in their built environment when it comes to not only environmental degradation and its impact, but also how people in the city find respite as we are visited by increasing adverse weather that claims lives across our region and across our nation and across the world. So in the pandemic, some of my research took me towards how historically frontline communities, what we now call frontline communities, but let's say communities that have always had to weather the impacts of climate and adverse weather, have thought about things like where they build homes and their relationship to a larger ecosystem and stewardship of natural resources like trees. And in fact, as human beings, we've always had to make decisions and determinations like this. And it's sometimes surprising that as modern societies, we are only now starting to realize that something like a tree canopy is vital for our survival. And in some cases, we are now behind in that regard. And so I'm thankful that we have people like Lowell and folks at the Tacoma Tree Foundation that are actively working to address some of these disparities, which I think do have a direct correlation with the work I'm now focusing on, which is urban environmental justice. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. So I'm going to share my screen now for, as Lowell mentioned, a short presentation. I think individually, we all might know what we mean when we say urban, when we say environmental, and when we say justice. But what do these words mean together? And so I thought I'd give us a little bit of a primer towards understanding how these three words, terms, and concepts intersect. So a useful definition that we can work with for now, and maybe as time goes by and our conversations lengthen and deepen, we can add to this. But when I say environmental justice, I'm talking about a recognition that the impacts of environmental degradation have not been spread out evenly among urban populations or populations in general, and that solutions to these impacts have often ignored or sidelined those who've mostly been affected by environmental injustice. So there's a lot going on in that definition, but something that we've known for a while now is that when it comes to environmental degradation and its impacts, not everybody experiences those the same way. In the 60s and 70s, when the environmental justice movement initiates, there's a very specific starting point for it. The federal government and a county in North Carolina were looking to cite a new site, a toxic waste dumping area, and it came down to two counties. One county was affluent and had a strong city government and good civic participation. They were able to stave off sort of the advances on part of the state and the federal government. The other county that was identified was a primarily Black community with not a very strong government, and because of historical and longstanding legacies of racism and poverty, there were barriers to civic engagement. So they were not as successful in using the official and civic systems to stave off the siting of this toxic waste dump site in their own community. So the community themselves organized, and together with religious leaders and other civic leaders, mounted sort of in a front to this plan by the federal government and the state government. And out of that effort, we have what we now might recognize as an environmental justice movement. We can deepen this conversation more, but some of you may be asking, how does environmentalism differ from environmental justice? Well, it really comes down to that recognition that sometimes environmentalism, and this was a critique that environmental justice movement leaders made on environmentalists, ignored the legacies of racism and marginalization and colonialism that often resulted in disparities in where things like toxic waste sites were cited. Often, environmentalists at the time were very premised on protecting the planet and ecosystems without much recognition that there were very real people involved in how these conversations were happening, or in the advocacy around planet and the environment. So environmental justice leaders bring in a much needed sense that we cannot talk about the environment and environmental degradation and its impacts without also recognizing that environmental degradation has not impacted everyone the same, and that when we talk about solutions to environmental degradation and its impacts, some of the very people who have been most impacted by it are not always included and are often sidelined from conversations about how we should address environmental degradation and its impacts. Moving ahead, that's my last slide. So how does the term urban come into play when we talk about environmental justice? So if you think about, and I referenced this at the outset of my comments, urban contexts have always been complex. We are talking about the environment, but we're also talking about housing. We're also talking about a homeless crisis that's impacting our city and the region and the nation. We're talking about transportation infrastructure. We're talking about different types of pollution. We're talking about whether or not we should densify. So when you think about all the complexity that already attends urban context, and then you add what we just said about how environmental degradation has not always been visited upon communities equally, and how those communities have not always had an equal say in how those impacts are addressed, then things get mixed up in an even more complicated way. So there is an environmental justice, and then there is urban environmental justice, which recognizes that an already complex system should now also recognize that environmental issues are impacting communities in our cities more than they are impacting other communities, and that sometimes those communities don't have an equal say in how those issues should be addressed. So urban environmental justice is really the adding of urban challenges plus historical inequities related to land use and environmental degradation. When you combine those, what we end up seeing is further marginalization and segregation into areas and situations that create further marginalization and deeper inequity. So it's a compounding issue. Poor neighborhoods, marginalized neighborhoods, communities, etc. They're already impacted by policies pertaining to land use and zoning and transportation that impact them in ways that marginalize them and segregate them and disempower them. And then you add environmental degradation to the mix, and these are the communities that are also potentially dying during heat waves or during flash floods, or who lack the networks and the resources to survive a changing climate and the extreme weather that it visits on us. So here's a case study that I think brings us back to some of the concerns that we share as a group today. This is one recent study. There are many studies that have been conducted in the US, as they have been around the world, correlating historical residential housing segregation, what some of us know as redlining, and urban tree canopy. And in this particular study, they studied 37 US cities. Actually, a former colleague of mine here at Tacoma did something very similar with colleagues on the Seattle campus to see how our own city demonstrates these same patterns. Where there has been historical residential housing segregation, there is a lack of tree canopy, which is effectively what this study found. In this abstract, if we move down to halfway, where on the right side it says urban trees, this is where I think we get that impact of what we're talking about here. Urban trees provide many ecosystem services. They mitigate the urban heat island effect, may improve quality of life in cities. In our prior research in Baltimore, Maryland, we discovered that redlining policy influenced the location and allocation of trees in parks. In this study, they say our analysis of 37 metropolitan areas here show that areas formerly graded D, which correlate with racial and ethnic minorities living there, have on average 23% less tree canopy covered today. So this was in 2021. In comparison, areas formerly graded A in these redlining maps, characterized by US-born white populations living in newer housing stock, they had nearly twice as much tree canopy, approximately 43% more. And they find that these results are consistent across small and large metropolitan regions. So this is one example of how urban environmental justice applies a lens that doesn't allow us to only think about environmental degradation and its impacts as happening equally to everyone, or everyone experiencing them equally. This article doesn't fully get into that other part that's of much interest to people that work through an environmental justice lens, which is, okay, so now that we know this, how do we incorporate knowledge, experience, expertise, and input from the very communities that have historically been marginalized by policy, so that our solutions to these issues are more equitable and just. The final thought I'll leave you with is Why is my thing not progressing? Maybe I added it. Maybe, yeah, this is it right here. My last slide somehow became my second slide. So one takeaway that I would leave with you today is the sense that urban environmental justice recognizes or holds as a central tenet the sense that all people have the right to live, work, and play in communities that are safe, healthy, and free of life-threatening conditions. That is perhaps what to me sort of is the promise of environmental justice. This is what we're striving for and towards. And in our particular context now, we're talking about things like who lives in neighborhoods that have a robust tree canopy. And if they don't have it, how does this correlate with other forms of injustice? And if we want them to have it, how do we incorporate people that live in those neighborhoods that are members of those communities in delivering those natural resources to them? So that's what I have for you today. I look forward to my conversation with Lowell and then to any questions that you may have for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's a great starting point. Really interesting to hear your overview and perspective. I always love thinking about the history of not only these movements that we have, but also the terms that we use. And so I guess kind of in that spirit, I want to ask you about this term that we've been hearing more lately, and that is the term urbanist. So you've written some pieces for the Urbanist magazine, which maybe you can say more about, but I wonder if you could talk about what that term urbanist means to you and how it maybe differs from words like environmentalism or even environmental justice. Like, how does this new framework fit into the work that you do?
Yeah. You know, this is taking me back to one of our initial conversations where I think I was at a point where I was ready to somewhat reject that term for myself. Which is not to say that I don't primarily think about and work and research in urban settings. They fascinate me. I'm interested in them. I live in a city. I love living in cities, and so to some that's enough, right? That's enough to say, well, you're an urbanist, right? You think about urban complexities and policy, and you have recommendations, and this is what you're interested in. And if we only leave it at that, then I would say, then yes, I am an urbanist. However, when you and I first started chatting, I was having a real conflict with that term because most of the people I was encountering and communicating with at the time really were not thinking about things like racial justice or spatial justice or environmental justice, right? And I'm not saying that everyone is this way, but there is a tendency often in conversations that use or invite the term urbanism or urbanist to imagine cities as systems, right? I think smart cities is one of the words that sort of comes to mind, or terms where we can talk about these systems as if they could be hacked, or if we can sort of tinker with policy and make things better. And what I always brought to my sense of urbanism is they're not really systems that could be necessarily hacked or tinkered with in this way. And they shouldn't be, because we're dealing with real people who do not experience urban context equally or in the same way. The same city could hold people that are having a hard time paying for housing. And over here, I might be interested in having a conversation on whether or not we should have a park in my neighborhood, right? Those are both two things that fit into the umbrella or the canopy of urbanism talk. But I do think that there is a risk sometimes to imagine, there is a risk of imagining that we're all on a level playing field when we're talking about urban complexity or cities, where things like legacies of colonialism, racism, poverty are not in the mix, right? It's not like, well, we can just pass housing reform in our city and everybody now suddenly has access to cheaper rent, better mortgages, and a big down payment to put on a house. That's not how it works. We can change a policy. We can talk about that policy. We could debate it. But if we're not also willing to invite how difference and histories of colonialism and racism impact these conversations, then I don't know if I'm interested in having those conversations. So that's why I think urban environmental justice as an all-encompassing term, because it automatically puts those factors into the conversation, is much more interesting to me.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. What I noticed, I was thinking about the comparison with environmentalism and urbanism, and I think environmentalism is kind of up for that same critique, right? Maybe urbanists care a lot about cities and celebrate cities, and environmentalists historically have really looked at rural places and wilderness areas and celebrated that. So I also liked how urban environmental justice puts the focus on people rather than just on nature or our experience of the physical place.
That's right.
So you are actually a writer and a teacher of writing.
Yes.
And you've kind of come to this urban environmental justice space more recently. And so I'm wondering what it's like in your writing. How does this play out in your research and work? And then also, how does this play out in the classes that you teach?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think sometimes I need to remind myself that my training and sort of my central way of being in the world is through words. And obviously I do a lot of writing, both as a scholar, but also as what I would call a public scholar. A lot of the same ideas that I'm trying to push and forward in my field are the ones I share through outlets like the Urbanist or Crosscut or other popular news sources. And really for me, it comes down to thinking about the city as a text. And what I mean by that is it's a text that can be read and written, right? And if we've all been sort of taught in grade school to decode messages out of little symbols that we call letters on the page, but the text is kind of the same thing, right? If we know how to decode the city, we can also read its messages. And if we want to, we could also write the city. And I think there's many ways of doing that. For me, walking is one way of writing the city, right? If putting my body in places where our current transportation policy has made it difficult for me to be, or where I'm not supposed to be, even though there's a sidewalk, speed limits, lack of crosswalks, etc. I'm reading that all as like, don't be here, even though you have a legal ability to be here. And by choosing to walk to work on many days, I am effectively rewriting a new path right through the city. So because I still primarily teach writing and rhetoric to students, often through the lens of cities or urban and environmental issues, what I'm asking students to do is to learn how to think about the city as something that could be read and written through use, through being there, by choices we make about how we move through it, how we live in it, etc. And to bring it sort of more concretely down to what we're talking about here, I think sometimes students have never been invited to think about the city as a text that can be read and written, right? And largely that's a fault of how we live and think about cities in our society, but it's also because I think we've limited our sense of writing and reading to alphabetic text. And I won't go further into that, but part of what motivates me to continue making sense of our urban complexities through writing is because writing is always just a way of thinking, right? When I don't understand something that well, I read a lot about it and then I write about it. And it's in the process of writing that I start making some notion, some movement towards how I think about it, right? And that's how I ask students to approach things that they don't understand, right? Let's read a lot about this. Let's talk about it in class, but then I want you to write about it. And for me, writing is first a way of thinking before it's a way of communicating or conveying your ideas. So I always tell students, it doesn't matter if it's polished, I don't care what the format is. I want you to think through what you're writing And when you're ready, if you're ready, then we can talk about what this needs to look like for a reader that's not you. So that's sort of two ways how I approach my teaching. I think about the city as a text, and then I also think about writing not as a primary mode of communicating, but as primarily a mode of thinking.
That's really great. I love the images of reading and writing. One of the things that I often notice when we do our tree walks at the Tree Foundation is that people realize afterwards that they pay attention in a different way. So it's just about the kind of attention that we pay to our surroundings, right? But I also love this idea that the physical surroundings that we have are not just static. The city is changing all the time. And if you look at it more of like a draft than like a final product, it's kind of a cool image to think about.
And putting ourselves in that draft and moving through the city, exploring it on foot, on bike, etc. I think cars give you less of access to the city. You're moving very fast. You don't notice things. It's a way of sort of, the city's not static. And if you wanted to change, put yourself in the city, right? There's a lot of ways to change the city. We can write policy, run for office, etc. A lot of us can't do that, don't aspire to do that, but we can put ourselves in the city and sort of revise the city as we move through it.
Absolutely. And just being a positive presence, I think makes a difference in the place. So I wondered, kind of thinking about going back to your teaching a little bit, how do students respond to this typically when maybe they haven't heard about urban environmental justice before, and all of a sudden they're confronted with an essay on the topic, or they have to go do a project in a certain place. What have you noticed so far about the way that students react when they're confronted with these new ways of thinking about the city?
So first of all, number one, a lot of the students that we see, I was talking to an administrator last week about this. We have this ring around Tacoma where we draw a lot of students from. It's like South King County and like areas like, Bonnie Lake and Covington, etc. So often they're coming to Tacoma and they know Seattle and they know Tacoma and they know other cities, but they don't live here, right? So I've had to find ways of getting students to realize that even though they don't live in Tacoma, they live in an urban and metropolitan region where what happens in Seattle impacts Tacoma, and what happens in Tacoma impacts Buckley or Sumner, etc., wherever they're from. And that, in fact, even though they live in smaller communities than the ones that we're in, they still live in urban areas, right? Because they're connected through roads and highways and economies to what they consider the city. And so, first of all, it's getting them to realize that they are as impacted and have as large an impact on the city as members of this metropolitan region, that it's not only people who live in Tacoma or live in Seattle that have a say, right, about urban settings and urban context. So that's the first thing that I noticed. And then, of course, we do have people that live in Tacoma, and I'll have students that are, their families have been here for multiple generations, and they have a lot of love and a lot of frustration about their city. And so it's always a really interesting mix. And a lot of my approach then has been to get students to talk to each other about what they have in common, even though some of them are only here to work or study and occasionally to do something fun, versus students that have been here and are sort of used to these conversations and are even willing to enter them in a more critical sense. When I added the environmental justice component, I see a similar reaction as I see when I, for example, teach a course on writing about climate change. It's a big, large looming issue. And like a lot of us, people don't always know how to think about it. They don't know what to do about it. They feel that they don't really have a role to play, that things are bad and they're probably going to get worse, or they might feel that climate change is real, but they come from families or they have relatives who don't want to hear anything about climate change being caused by humans. So climate change in the classroom is as complicated and as sort of ungrabbable as it is, I think, in public conversations that we have over media or amongst friends. So initially there's resistance, not because they don't believe it's happening, but because they don't know what they can possibly do about it. And I'm always very realistic with students. One of the first things I say in classes is, we are here for 10 weeks. We are not going to solve climate change. We're not even going to make a meaningful dent in the issue. But what we can do, and I think this is where students end up allowing me some buy-in, is recognizing the ways that it is impacting us in very personal ways, right? So I had one student last year who lives out in Bonnie Lake, has recently moved out of Bonnie Lake, but he's like, that's just not a thing that I hear a lot about in my community. I don't know really what to say about it. And so he was grappling with what he could possibly do or say towards such a big existential issue. And over a series of conversations, it finally dawned on him that, again, because I'm always sort of like, yeah, let's not think about it as a global thing or even a regional thing. Let's think about it as a neighborhood thing, as a thing that's happening to your friends or your family. And what he came up with is, he has a good friend from high school who is a volunteer firefighter who was fighting the fires 2 summers ago in and around Bonnie Lake, up Highway 520, or I forget what the highway is, where it was jumping the road onto very close to communities in Bonnie Lake. And he says that in conversations he's had with his friend, he realized just how dire our situation is and how close his friend not only came to potentially losing his life, but some of his own friends and family members may be losing their homes. And suddenly he realized, oh, I can say something about that. I might not be able to change my entire community's sense of climate change, but I can talk about the dangers that increasing fire risk in our region poses to people I care about and I know. So for a lot of students, it's been a challenge to think about it as a big existential issue, but they find ways of thinking about it and writing about it when you get them to think about how it's impacting them. I had another student who realized that in this course that her family had been talking about moving to Florida and buying beachfront property. And she realized, oh my gosh, I need to write something to get them to rethink this decision, and so they each find a way into it that I think for me in 10 weeks is a good initial step towards getting all of us to think more critically about what's happening around us and what we might be able to say about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, finding not only your angle on the topic, but also a little bit of your own voice is a great achievement. And I think something that we can all think about. And I love that idea of the different scales, right? Like finding your local connection to maybe a regional or planetary issue. You can do something because you have more agency in your own neighborhood.
Right.
Well, at the risk of weighing into a controversial topic here, I do want to talk about home in Tacoma a little bit, which is this new kind of zoning law that's happening in our city. And I want to raise it with you because I think you've written about it a little bit. And I know that it impacts trees, and people have talked with me a lot about it. How are these changes that are kind of expected for our city going to impact our tree canopy, and how do we weigh things like the need for housing with the need for trees? So I just wanted to invite you to kind of weigh in on this, and then we'll see what kind of responses we get to. But tell us a little bit about your take on home in Tacoma and how it intersects with these issues you're talking about.
Yeah. So, if you've read what I've written, my general sense is that we need housing reform in the type that we have attempted to pass here in Tacoma, and which Spokane more deftly recently passed. It is one approach to achieving greater housing equity, making housing more attainable in our region. One approach, I say, and it's a powerful one. And as you're pointing out, and this is something I've written about, we shouldn't think that home in Tacoma in its phases is going to be the panacea that we're looking for, but it is a really meaningful step towards that. And yes, it's going to reveal greater disparities in our city and potentially create conflicts that were already there, or maybe they were there and we didn't know they were. And that's okay, right? I've said this in other forums where policy is never perfect, right? It's an approach and an attempt to do something better than what we've been doing, and if it's been done well, it's going to move the needle in a positive direction. But it's not perfect, and it shouldn't be perfect. And as you mentioned earlier, cities are not in stasis. Cities are always becoming. And home in Tacoma has already started revealing meaningful contradictions, conflicts, and tensions, and that is okay. Where do we want the density to happen? How is it going to impact property values? How does it impact the historic nature of certain neighborhoods? Is it going to mean that we tear down trees to build more density? All those things should be coming up, and we need to take each one of those in turn and think about them critically and think about them ethically. And I think there is a way forward where all of these can be addressed, not in a way that every single party is going to be satisfied or happy with the result, but in a way where more Tacomans are better off on the other end of it. Whether that means that you can suddenly afford to buy a house in our city, or it means that your neighborhood is getting many more trees on the right of ways and planting strips. And if it means that the city and the county are gonna cooperate to bring more transit down certain corridors that don't have it, but now need it because there's more density there. All of these things are meaningful steps that need to come up as we are making these larger strides to welcome more people into our city. So one of the things that I learned in conversations with you and as a result of Home in Tacoma coming up is that we don't have a meaningful support system for people who plant trees as new developments, right? So it's great that as a city, we require people or developers to put trees into planting strips, but that's not enough. Now what's emerged is this realization that we also need to support people in keeping those trees alive and sustaining them until they're mature and are actually contributing to our tree canopy. I don't know if that would have come up for me without passing Home in Tacoma and asking questions about what's happening to trees. Are we getting more trees? Where are those trees going? But now with that, we know that that surfaced as a gap in our policy. One of us, maybe me, maybe you, can start writing policy for the city and working with the Planning Commission to say, let's get trees into planting strips. Let's also support residents in keeping them alive, right? So that's like one small example. But my sense is that we need Home in Tacoma. It could have been more bold, but this is the compromise that we have achieved. Now we are figuring out how to implement it equitably and justly. And necessarily it's going to raise tensions and bring up issues that we didn't know were there before, or maybe were ignoring before. And now because of Home in Tacoma, we can address them, and Home in Tacoma and our overall ability to thrive and be in the city, right? To go back to what I said about urban environmental justice, where everyone has a right to live in a safe, healthy, and free from, hazards. We all have the right, and I think Home in Tacoma is helping us do that more, as imperfect as it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the way you talked about it in the very beginning as housing equity. So when we understand housing as a justice issue in the same way that we're understanding trees and where they're located as a social justice issue, it kind of reframes the conversation, at least for me, and thinking about making our city more inclusive, as opposed to just kind of protecting our neighborhoods that happen to have a lot of trees already or something. So I would add that I think a great benefit of the conversation around Home in Tacoma is that we learned how many people care about trees, because people started to really speak up and say, like, if we add all these apartments and backyards, what's going to happen to our tree canopy? And as I've talked with you about, I think my response to that is that the city needs to preserve its tree canopy and have an ordinance on the books that gets us there. It can't just be related to the housing issue.
Yes, I mean, it could be part of it, but there should also just be a very robust tree canopy policy, where not only do we protect the trees that we have, we actually enhance it, especially in areas that really need it.
Yeah, thanks. I'm coughing a little bit here. So I think I'm going to turn over to a couple audience questions, and I'd encourage everybody here to weigh in, ask a question, give a comment in the Q&A. That's great. I'm going to start off with a question from Eric, which is that one issue, Eric says, one issue that I've heard is that the urban greening causes housing prices to increase and thus forces low-income communities out. Is there anything happening in Tacoma that addresses this issue?
Not that I'm aware of. Do you have any knowledge of anything that is working in that regard?
I don't have any knowledge about that exactly. Although I think the idea that adding trees to properties that increases property values, that does tend to be true. Like, I think the research bears that out. So sometimes this gets talked about as green gentrification, right? Like,
yes,
new trees going into a neighborhood might be a signal that the neighborhood's changing and they're developing it differently.
Yeah, and I have read some about green gentrification. I work with a student at the Seattle campus who wrote her senior thesis on that. And one of the conversations we had in regards not to tree canopy, but she was thinking it through the lens of adding pocket parks to neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And one thing that we talked about is we can ask a different question, right? I think even people who live in low-income neighborhoods would say that they would want their property values to rise, and they also want tree canopy, right? For all the benefits that we know that tree canopy brings. I tend to sometimes reject and resist formulations of the problem that say, well, you can't have both. You can't have high property values and attainable housing. So we're going to keep trees out of the equation. I'm more interested in conversations that say, how do we work towards policies that bring trees to neighborhoods, allowing those property values to rise? Some of these folks, myself included, we don't have the privilege of having generational wealth. So if I can get into a house and fix it up and increase its property value, for me, that's a net gain, right? And if planting trees in my neighborhood is going to help with that, I'm happy to see those trees. What we need is more robust social and civic infrastructure that allows people to stay in place. And that's always been a need, even when we don't have trees in the equation. Because as neighborhoods start getting amenities, and I'm not even talking about gentrification 1.0, where small coffee shops, cupcake shops, and Urban Outfitters sort of shows up to the neighborhood, increases property values, and displaces people. I'm just talking about what can cities do, because gentrification, if I may put a pause here, looks different in different places, right? There is no such thing as like a generic type of gentrification. There's gentrification in LA, New York, Chicago, Tacoma, Seattle. What we can do is recognize, okay, folks might be displaced if we don't create safety nets and infrastructure to keep them in place. And I have colleagues that are working on things like land trusts or community groups that come together and sort of pool their resources to beautify the neighborhood, but that also ensure that they stay in place. There's a lot of tools we have at our disposal if we're willing to pull them out of the toolbox and use them to make sure that people have higher property values, tree canopy, and the ability to stay.
I think that's a great reframing of the issue. Yeah, in some ways, gentrification is not, it's more about the displacement that happens maybe. And there's a lot of things that go into displacement apart from just how many trees there are in a neighborhood. I also just wanted to add that one of the things that we do at the Tree Foundation in our goal of bringing trees to neighborhoods that need them the most is to help people that want to make those investments in their neighborhood that haven't been allowed to invest in their neighborhoods in the past. And so I think when we think about our history with redlining, which literally dictated where investments would happen across the city. And then those statistics you cited earlier about how much that benefited some groups over others, we're trying to recognize that happened and start to make some corrections.
Mhm.
So empowering community members is a great way to do that.
Mhm. Yeah.
There's another question here in the chat, and that is from Gail. Is the city considering how and whether to expand tree canopy in industrial areas that are not necessarily residential? These seem to be the ugliest places that provide more opportunity to expanding the urban forest.
Yeah. I don't know of any. What do you know though?
I know quite a bit about this. I'm looking out right now. I'm over the Port of Tacoma, since I'm sitting in the Union Club where our office is, and there's a big industrial area at the mouth of the Puyallup River, and it's currently being planned for a sub-area planning process. So that particular industrial area is going to get a whole reimagining in the next couple of years. And so that's a great opportunity to weigh in on this idea that industrial areas and green don't have to be incompatible. So I think there's not a specific effort underway to plant trees in those areas for a couple of reasons. And one of those is that there's a lot of pavement in our industrial areas. The city has allowed a lot of paving over to happen, like our Tide Flats area that I'm looking at out the window used to be a natural estuary, and now it's primarily pavement. So what does that mean? It limits the opportunities there are to plant trees. So there's not a lot of plantable space across the city, and the industrial areas tend to be the spaces with the fewest areas to plant trees. So there's quite a few obstacles even before you get into the question of whether individual property owners want to plant trees in those areas. But I think there's a lot of room for residents to kind of stand up and require the city to incentivize tree planting in those neighborhoods, because that's got to be part of the solution. The Tide Flat sub area has a 3% tree canopy coverage, and the city as a whole has only a 20% tree canopy. So there's a huge opportunity there to both preserve the trees that are down there and then add some more in the future. And there's a business case for doing that too. If we think about those industries attracting customers and having nice spaces for customer service, trees help with that as well. Are there other questions from the audience? We have a couple more minutes left. We're gonna cut it off at 6:30, but happy to read any
I
other
wanted to ask
questions.
you something, Lo. I know other cities have a dedicated tree staff, right? At least, I forgot why I was looking into this 2 or 3 years ago, but many cities hire tree scientists, right? And then also people that just have the capacity to maintain trees and they know about tree health, etc. Does Tacoma have any staff that is dedicated to our tree canopy and the health of our trees? Because I mean, we have, as much as we have a lack in tree canopy, we also have some pretty majestic, beautiful old trees in our city.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to look at that. My first thought was in the urban forestry department, which is where a lot of the policy happens at the city. They don't have anyone working as an arborist crew. So they currently can't plant trees on their own property even. So that's a big limitation. On the other hand, there's an open space program where there are staffers who are restoring our open spaces and steep slopes. So there's some care and maintenance happening in those kinds of areas, natural areas across the city. But in terms of urban forestry, most cities our size have about 10 employees working in urban forestry. So the fact that we just have 3 on staff is a big problem. And it's one of the reasons that we're not really getting closer to our tree canopy goals. So one kind of call to action is for people to ask the city to fund the urban forest management plan, which is the plan that was implemented a couple of years ago and has everything that we would need to do to get to the 30% tree canopy goal. But staffing has been an issue, and COVID kind of put a wrench into that as well. On the positive side, I think the city is now working with the Tree Foundation as a partner on several projects. And so we're really exploring the value of community partnerships. And I think that we're making some progress in that area.
All right, great.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, if not, I will share just one kind of closing couple thoughts here as we wrap up our webinar. Want to thank you, Rubén, for being part of this. This is a view of our new website, tacomatreefoundation.org. So please check it out. You can look at our programs and look at our calendar to see the next events that we have coming up. I also wanted to call attention to a couple of special opportunities. The first one is called Branch Out. It's our biggest tree giveaway of the year, where we work with the city and the Pierce Conservation District to, where our goal is to distribute 500 trees this year. And so it's happening over Veterans Day weekend. We have yet to determine our location, but we did it back in February and it was a huge success. We had almost 300 trees delivered and planted across the city. So this is a great opportunity to either receive a tree from us and our partners or get involved as a volunteer. We're going to be sending volunteers around to homes to offer planting assistance. And the other is on the right. It's our auction, which is coming up, called Greening Tacoma Together. It's an online auction, and I'd invite everyone to go to our website and register for the opportunity. We're supporting a lot of local businesses who are supporting us by donating items and experiences. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what items we have this year and bidding on a few myself. The one I found today that's coming through is a farm experience and sheep snuggling experience. So I think that might be a popular one. But check out our online auction and support the work that we do. And finally, just invite everybody to keep in touch. Of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and you can always email us with questions. So thanks so much, Rubén. It's been great talking with you.
Yeah, thank you, Lowell, and thanks everyone for joining us.
All right. Have a great night, everyone.